here we are at one of the more mysterious monuments on campus. And I say it's mysterious because almost nobody knows what it is, even though everybody has passed by it a million times. I came here as a freshman in '77, and I didn't know what this was until probably 2001, when I started doing my research. I mean, I knew it was an obelisk, and what's funny, of course, is it tells you exactly what it is. When you read it, this is the grave of the first president of the University of North Carolina. Right? This is Joseph Caldwell's grave, and along with him are buried his wife and her son, and that's mentioned over here. So Joseph Caldwell, and if you read the other side, you'll see, moved to Chapel Hill from New Jersey. New Jersey in 1795 was a slave state, but not very much of a slave state. So when he moved here, one of the first acts he engaged in was buying an enslaved person. Shortly thereafter, he married a very wealthy widow, who is she, and he acquired more enslaved people by doing that. One of the people that he bought, one of the people he got by marrying Helen Hogg Hooper Caldwell, well, she became Caldwell when they got married, was a man named November. And in all of the university's records, his name was November Caldwell. What's interesting to me about an unsung founders monument at the University of North Carolina is that if there is any place in the United States where the names of enslaved people were known, it was here. Right? If you were on a plantation in Fayetteville or Greenville or Mobile or Birmingham, your names might be preserved and they might not. And your names would probably change a lot over time. A faculty member who recently left us for the University of Pennsylvania is Heather Williams. And her most recent project was looking at how formerly enslaved people at the end of the Civil War tried to find their loved ones. And it was incredibly depressing, as most things involved with slavery are, account. She, doing research for a book on literacy, she kept finding ads in newspapers that family members of enslaved people placed to try to find their children, their husbands, their wives, their parents. And they would say things like, in 1835, a little boy named John was owned by the Smith family. I don't know what his name is after that. Because slave owners changed your first name, and if you were sold 4 or 5 times, you might have 4 or 5 different names. And particularly if you were very small, you might never know what your previous names were. Last names were completely random. Most enslaved people didn't have what we would think of as a last name. They were just the property of somebody. But in Chapel Hill, we see last names fairly often. We see people with identities that precede the person who currently owns them, and often last beyond that. So in the early 1800s, there's a man named November Caldwell who is well documented in President Caldwell's records, in President Swain's records, in students' records. In 1835, Joseph Caldwell died. He lived where the current president's house is, and if you were reading the Daily Tar Heel near the beginning of the semester, you would see that the foundation of his house was just excavated when a new driveway was being put in at Tom Ross's house. And it's not exactly where the current house is. So that house was built by Joseph and Helen. And when he died, she wanted to stay there, right? She had helped pay for it, and that meant the new president couldn't move into that house. The new president also couldn't move into the president's house. The university supplied a president's house, just like we do now, and it was over where Swain Hall is, at the corner of Cameron and Columbia. Cameron didn't exist back then, but that's where it is now. Professor Elisha Mitchell lived in that house. Why do you know Elisha Mitchell?
Mount Mitchell.
Mount Mitchell, and if you're a geology student, Mitchell Hall on campus. So Elisha Mitchell is very well known in North Carolina history because he climbed Mount Mitchell and died. Actually, it wasn't called Mount Mitchell until he climbed it and fell off and died. And that was his contribution to North Carolina. He was the presiding professor at UNC. And if you were black at UNC, however, if you were one of the enslaved people here, or if you were one of the black townspeople, you knew him because he was the largest slave owner among the faculty. He owned 20 to 40 people at any time, and they lived over here in cabins and the carriage houses. So he was well known as a large slave owner. And he was occupying the president's house, which meant that the new president, David Swain, had to build or buy a house somewhere else. He bought a house right next door to the current president's house. That long story is there because Mr. Swain was a former governor of North Carolina. He was a planter, so he had a fairly large number of slaves, and he had a young daughter. And if you know UNC history, she comes into the story because it's she who got her father killed by marrying a Union soldier. But his young daughter meant that in the household they probably had youngish female slaves to act as nannies and nursemaids and cooks. A young woman lived in David Swain's house, right across the street, right across the way from the Caldwell house. And her name was Rosa Burgess. So we have November Caldwell and Rosa Burgess living right next door to each other, both of them the property of university presidents. You see where the unsung part is becoming problematic? We know the names of people, we know about their identities. Rosa and November fell in love with each other. Did they get married? Why not? Because it was not legal. Enslaved people could not engage in a legal contract, but do you think their owners prohibited them from acting like married people? No. Slave owners loved for their enslaved property to act like they were married people. Why? It produced more enslaved people. It also tended to prevent people from running away, right? If people were in a committed relationship, as committed as it could be when somebody can sell you, they tended to run away less. So marriage was actually promoted, just not legal marriage, not marriage that had any binding contract to it. So Rosa became pregnant by November and had a son named Wilson. Wilson is probably one of the two most famous enslaved people on this campus. Well, to me, I don't know about to you, but he will be by the time we're done. What was Wilson's last name? What was your guess?
Caldwell.
Caldwell, that is wrong. Okay, whose last name was?
Mitchell.
Wrong.
Oh.
See, I made you say it just so I could say you're wrong. Yes, Swain. You get the full credit. You are not your mother's son. You are not your father's son. You are the person who owns your mother's property. So and you don't usually get to see it that clearly, but because there were so many records of what enslaved people did, in all the university records, this little boy was known as Wilson Swain. Now you're right, he ended up Caldwell. After the end of the Civil War, he changed his name because he wanted to be his father's son and not his mother's owner's property. But he, for the first 19 years of his life, was Wilson Swain. So there's three people who all worked on the university, all worked for the students. In fact, of course, the whole university at that time was what's now Old East, which at that time was called Maine. The students who lived in that building paid $1 a semester for rent. Your dorm rent was $1 a semester. Your tuition, you'll be happy, particularly if you're out of state to know, was $15. So it was $15 a semester tuition, $1 a semester for your room rent, and $2 a semester for slave hire. The university had a budget line for slave hiring. And that was what the university did not own any slaves. The faculty owned slaves, the administration owned slaves, and people were rented from the community and beyond to serve the campus and serve the students. That's what that $2 a semester fee was for. November Caldwell, Wilson Swain, Rosa Burgess, Dilsey Craig, a number of other people were used by the students to clean out their toilet pots. That was a requirement. The students had to bring a bucket so that they didn't have to go to the privy at night. They would go in their room and then somebody else would clean it. The university had a building at that time, right? Old East was the first, Person was the second, and Stewart's Hall was a wooden structure which hasn't existed for over 150 years. But it was over near where New East is. It was kind of in the middle of where Cameron Avenue is. And it was the place that the university stored the slaves it rented. Obviously, November and Wilson and Rosa lived there, and battle slaves lived at his place. But the university rented people from as far away as Texas. And those people who were rented were warehoused in the Stewart's Hall. We have records of the building being expanded as more people came into the community. The point I want you to have before we move is, if you were in Chapel Hill in the early 1800s, you were probably almost as likely to run into a black person as a white person when you were walking around campus. It's not the way we tend to think of our past, right? It's unsung and hidden. I always think of, if you've ever gone to Williamsburg, Virginia, and done their tour of, the moment before the Revolution, 51% of the people in Williamsburg were black. But you would never know or think about that unless you take the other half tour. It's kind of interesting, there's a tour for the other half, which is only one tour, whereas all the other tours are for that half. And actually it's 49%, so it's not quite a half. When we think about our past, we think about Hinton James, we think about Cornelia Phillips Spencer, we think about Mary Ruffin Smith, we think about David Swain and Joseph Caldwell, but there were dozens of people behind them who we don't think about, and that's what we're trying to change here.